Hello and welcome back to the Annie Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And on today's episode, we're very excited to be joined by one of the authors who will be appearing at Annie Castle this year.
On Tuesday the 9th of July, we'll be hosting a talk by Annie Garthwaite, author of the best-selling historical novel Cecily, as part of the tour for her new book, The King's Mother. Tickets are available now from the Alnwick Castle website and from our Eventbrite page.
Cecily told the story of Cecily Neville, one of the most important women of the Wars of the Roses, and saw her rise through adversity to become the mother of King Edward IV in 1461. The King's Mother tells the story of Cecily's attempt to retain her new authority alongside and against three other powerful female figures of the time. I spoke to Annie all about Cecily, the King's Mother, and her upcoming appearance here at Alnwick Castle. We've tried to avoid spoilers where possible. Please enjoy our conversation. So we are thrilled to be joined on the Alnwick Castle podcast by the author of Cecily and now the King's Mother, Annie Garthwaite. Thank you very much for being with us. How are you?
Oh, you're very welcome. It's great to be with you, and especially with that photograph of Alnwick Castle right behind you. It's telling me exactly where I'm going to be on the 9th of July this year.
Well, very excited to have you. We are coming here to talk about your new book, The King's Mother.
Yeah.
Had you always planned to write another novel of that period after Cecily?
Yes, because my abiding interest, literally for the last 40 years, has been in the women of the Wars of the Roses. And it began with Cecily, who, to my mind, is the great matriarch of the wars. You know, she's the one woman who survives them from the very beginning to the very end, and sees triumph and disaster along her path. But also those other three fabulous women who come into the story at this point. So this novel opens in 1461 when Cecily's son Edward is just becoming king. But over the period of the next 30 years, he will be challenged, and Cecily, as king's mother, will be challenged by three other women, all intent upon putting their boy on the throne and becoming king's mother themselves. And really there are two arcs to her story, if you like. There's that, in the first novel, we're looking at Cecily in her early years when she is becoming the Duchess of York, establishing her dynasty and seeing her son become Edward IV. And then in this book, we return to Cecily's world when Edward has become king. But this book is so rich because it gives us those other three great women of the Wars of the Roses, Margaret Beaufort, Elizabeth Woodville, and Marguerite of Anjou. And they're driven to do that by events, by envy, by fear, by dread. All kinds of circumstances coalesce to make that happen. But it is such a dramatic story, this second book. Some of the twists and turns in it, if you didn't know it was history, you'd think it was too ridiculous for fiction, because the Wars of the Roses were so eventful, let's say, and the women were at the absolute core of it all.
So you've mentioned Cecily. She was Edward IV's mother and then eventually Richard III's as well. The other three women that you mentioned, just in case our listeners don't know who they are in the context of the Wars of the Roses, can you explain who each of the other three women were a little bit more?
Yes. Shall I briefly introduce them?
Yes.
The other three women who come together in this story are, first of all, Marguerite of Anjou. And as the novel opens, she is Queen of Henry VI, recently deposed. We have Elizabeth Woodville, who somewhere into the novel becomes the wife and queen of Edward IV. And we have Margaret Beaufort, who is the mother of Henry Tudor. And we all know where Henry Tudor ends up in 1485. So it really is about the power struggle between those four women. And I thought, to sort of set the scene, it might be nice just to read you the prologue at the start of the novel, which really gives us an introduction to what's going on. So the novel opens in Easter 1461. A new dynasty is born in blood. 18-year-old Edward Plantagenet cuts a swathe through his enemies to make England's crown his own. And his mother, matriarch of the House of York, takes for herself a new title, one no woman in England has ever borne, Lady Cecily, the King's mother. It acknowledges her body, which brought this young king forth, and the courage with which she cleared his path to the throne. It signals the guiding hand she will lay on his kingship, mother, confidant, counsellor, and guide. It is hers by right and by earning. In the getting of it, she has lost a son and her husband, but in the progress of Edward's tumultuous reign, there will be other women who, driven by ambition, necessity, or dread, will seek the throne for other sons. They will be no less fierce nor resolute. They will have no less cause. Cecily, Marguerite, Elizabeth, Margaret, the King's mother. There can only be one.
Thank you very much for that. That was one of my favourite parts of the book when I read it, that setting off the scene for what was going to come. How important was it for you to have that short prologue to sort of introduce the characters before the rest of the action kicked off?
I think for me, it focuses the reader's eye exactly where I want it to be, which is on the women. You know, the story of the Wars of the Roses has been told so many times, but it's always told from the men's viewpoint. Mm-hmm. Not surprisingly, perhaps, because it's a series of wars, and it's the guys who go away and wave their swords about and fight the battles, right? And it's they who lose or win. But the thing for me about the Wars of the Roses is that you have these four women who are absolutely central to the action, and yet so often ignored by historians or novelists. Mm-hmm. And to me, they're not just, it's easy for us to assume that women are just victims of the wars or bystanders to the wars, or they suffer through the wars. But these women were driving the action. They were often the perpetrators of conflict and dispute, and they weren't afraid to roll up their sleeves and get involved in it. When Marguerite of Anjou tries to win the throne back for Henry VI, it's her that's leading at the head of the army, not him. We all know that Henry VII, Henry Tudor, defeated Richard III on the battlefield at Bosworth, but he would never have got to the battlefield. He would never have made it back to England to fight if his mother, with all of her machinations and all of her manoeuvring, hadn't cleared a path for him. So I really want the reader to understand right from the get-go that we're seeing the Wars of the Roses through a new lens, if you like, mm-hmm. and we're seeing it with the women at the absolute heart. And I think that's interesting because, I said before that the Wars of the Roses are very complex and eventful, and it seems to me that even today historians can't agree about what happened, why and when. It's so conflicted. And I think that confusion is often because they ignore the women. And when you put the women back in the story and think about what their actions were and what their motivations were, the whole story begins to make a lot more sense. So I thought that prologue kind of, focused the reader's eye where I need it to be. I hope.
No, I think it definitely did. And in the book, and in Cecily as well, it's very clear how much she's leading Edward's focus to each point. And there's a lot of scenes where it's just those two having a conversation, and he's acting much like a child to his mother, and she's kind of almost telling him what to do and how to be kingly. Yes. So I think the focus is very much how they were influenced by the men rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and especially, when you think about it, when this novel opens and Edward, against all expectation, has become king, he's 18 years old. He's only a very young man. I mean, in today's day and age, we would think of him as a boy. He's still a teenager. I appreciate in the 15th century, people were adult earlier, I guess, but still very young and not really expecting to be a king, so arguably not prepared. Very good at fighting, winning every battle every battle you pitch him into. Very good with a sword, but perhaps not the most mature and prepared political mover. Cecily, meanwhile, was in her mid-40s by this time and had decades of experience of operating at the centre of English politics, working both independently and alongside her husband, Richard, Duke of York. So I think it was very natural, particularly at the beginning of his reign, for Edward to lean on Cecily and lean on her advice and so on and so forth, and to see her as his confidant. It's interesting to me that when Edward is fighting for his crown, he wins a battle on the Welsh borders called Mortimer's Cross. He comes to London where Cecily is waiting. He relieves the siege on London. And he accepts his kingship, but then he's got to head north because there's another army waiting to fight him. So who does he leave in charge of his kingdom, his new kingdom, while he goes off to fight? Not one of the blokes, not one of his captains or generals or the lords, his mum. And he makes her head of his household, which is effectively his regent while he's fighting in the north. So you can imagine, as the novel opens, he's up north fighting. She's in London, holding on to the reins of power, when the nation is really in a state of regime change and crisis, and she's keeping all of the plates spinning and all of the balls in the air. She's the woman who knows what's going on in this world.
How did you go around researching all of these different characters and different events? Was it difficult? Did you enjoy doing it?
I have to say it's been something of a life's work, because I first got interested in this period of history when I was a teenager in school, and that is a very, very long time ago. I went to a not very brilliant comprehensive school in the northeast of England, but I had one. You get one of those teachers occasionally who are just inspirational and brilliant, and I had a teacher like that for history, and he was teaching us about the Wars of the Roses for A-level. And honestly, he taught those events as if they happened yesterday, and I was just hooked. And I just became fascinated by not just the events, but the personalities behind the events. And that's why this teacher was so brilliant, because while every other history teacher in the country, I think, was trying to force feed kids with dates and, numbers and the names of battles, he was interested in the people. He'd ask the important questions like, why do you think he did that? Or what do you think she was thinking when he did that? Or what was the motivation for this happening? So he threw me right into people's heads, which, 40 years later as a novelist is really rich. So it's true to say that I've been researching these books and this story and these people for upwards of 40 years. And it's funny, because I promised myself that when I was age 55, I would give up the day job and write this story. That came along in 2017, and I gave up the day job and I started to write this story. And having spent 40 years reading about it all, I thought, I know this story now, right? Okay, all I've got to do is write it down. And the minute I sat down to put pen to paper, I thought, no, I think I need to go and do a bit more research. It's endless, it never stops. But it has absolutely been a lifelong passion, and is still.
So do you think you would go further or explore different areas of the Wars of the Roses for different novels in the future?
I think with this second novel, The Wars of the Roses Night, are done for now. And I have started work on a third novel, but it's set in an earlier period of history. I can't say too much about it. It's very exciting, but it's also terrifying, because it's an area of history that I know a lot less about than I do about the Wars of the Roses. And I haven't got 40 years left to research it in, so I'm going to have to find a way to speed that process up.
And then going back to the King's Mother, I mentioned the prologue was one of my favourite parts. One of the other bits that I really, really liked was actually after Edward IV had died and what was then coming up. And as I knew the kind of where it was going to lead up to, it still made it really exciting for how was the young boys going to disappear, what was Richard going to do, what was Cecily going to do. How do you find writing pieces of history that people kind of already have an idea about, but to make it more exciting and make it still, they're not quite knowing where you're going to go with that?
Yes. It's interesting, isn't it? when you read a book that has a contemporary setting, that isn't set on history, that is entirely made up, it's very easy to create suspense because the reader genuinely doesn't know what's going to happen next. But for a historical novelist, the challenge is to create the same element of suspense, even though everyone knows what's going to happen, or a lot of people reading the book will know what's going to happen. We all know that, no, this isn't a spoiler, Henry Tudor wins in the end. We all know that's going to happen. But I think the way that you create that sense of anticipation still and suspense and oh no, what's going to happen next? I must turn the next page, is just by focusing absolutely on the people who are experiencing these tumultuous events, to make it deeply, deeply personal to them. And if you can get the reader to really walk in the shoes of your characters and feel everything that they are feeling, then that sort of page-turning anticipation is there. Someone, and I can't remember who it was, but they said, a historian will tell you what happened, but a novelist will tell you what it felt like. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing that we try to do. The challenge with writing a lot of this story is that the characters in it are oftentimes very contentious, no less so than with Richard III, of course. And everyone thinks they know that Richard was the hunchback tyrant who murdered the princes in the Tower. And because of new research that's come out, we know that Richard wasn't a hunchback for a start, when his body was discovered in 2012 and we discovered the scoliosis. And, there is now compelling evidence that he absolutely did not kill the princes in the Tower and that they survived the end of his reign and lived on into the times of the Tudors. So there is a whole sort of reassessment of Richard's history going on, which I've been embroiled in and excited by for the past 40 years. Because to me, the challenge has always been reconciling the Richard that is well documented in his lifetime up until the point when he takes the throne, with the tyrannical monster that suddenly appears out of nowhere the very day that he does. Mm-hmm. Because the young Richard is painstakingly loyal to his brother Edward. He's a cautious, careful man. He's a scholar. He has a scholarly, lawyery kind of mind. He's an expert in the law. He appreciates fair dealing. He was extremely well respected as Duke of Gloucester when he was living in and ruling over much of the north. And a very capable administrator and a capable soldier who was trusted implicitly by his family and by his brother Edward IV. And I could never square that with suddenly this tyrannical monster that appears in the summer of 1483. It makes no sense. So in approaching the character of Richard, I've said to myself, okay, so what if after 1483, Richard just carries on being what he's always been? A fair-minded, just, loyal to his family man. And where does that take us?
It's definitely an interesting way of doing it, because I've read a lot of different novels about different periods, and it's really interesting to see all the different ideas. And then because it's a novel, you can create these stories easily. And then all of the different theories are like, oh yeah, it could be true. Yeah, that could be true.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. With writing both of these novels, my sort of guidance to myself has been to stick with historical truth. When we know something absolutely, then don't shy away from it. If we know that something happened on such and such a day in such and such a way and these people were there, then let's not pretend that's not the case. We've all seen lots of TV dramas where history is made up with abandon. Mm-hmm. I would never do that. I'm a bit Star Trek about it. Don't mess with the timeline because you'll mess up the future. But when there are gaps in what we know, when what we know is contested and difficult to discover, then you have to look at everything you do know and say, okay, so what is likely? What is plausible? What might have happened? And avoid being fanciful about it. What is plausible and realistic? And see where that takes you in telling the story. You have to put all of your characters in place. with what we know of them historically and remain true to their historical character. How are they likely to behave in a given circumstance or situation? And go with that. And when you feel yourself drifting away from that, you have to give yourself a strict talking to and come back.
So we've now talked a bit about the men. So we've gone to Richard, we've gone to the princes. Let's go back to the women again.
Yes.
So in your novel, both Cecily and then in The King's Mother as well, Cecily is obviously the main character. What do you think of her? Do you think she was a heroine, or do you think she was a little bit more complex than that?
I think everyone's a little bit more complex than that. I think one of the things with history, and particularly with women in history, the temptation is to make them two-dimensional. You know, here is a good person, here is a bad person, black hat, white hat. You know, it's very easy to do that. And no one is all good and no one is all bad. And it particularly happens with women. And I think this dates right back to the way that women have been viewed through history. Women are either the adored and virtuous objects of chivalric love, or they are the wicked temptresses who lead men astray and into trouble, and they are the daughters of Eve and the source of all sin. Well, that's complete nonsense. It isn't true of Cecily, and it isn't true of any of the other three. None of these women are wholly good or wholly bad. They are women like you and I, set in a very difficult and complex set of circumstances that do things that you or I might think appalling, but which are completely comprehensible within the context of what's going on. One of the things I really wanted to investigate with this book is what a mother will do for a son. Because, you know, when it comes to it, all of these women, all four of them, their number one objective ultimately is to protect their children and put them in a place of complete safety. And that place of complete safety happens to be the throne of England. And they will do sometimes quite dreadful things, including betray each other, in order to make that happen. And I think that's something that we as modern women can really tune into and understand, you know, that how far will mother love drive you? What will you be prepared to do?
One of my favourite relationships in this book is probably one of the most contentious, which is between Cecily and Elizabeth Woodville, because they never seem to get on very well, even when they're on the same side.
Yeah.
Is that how you think Cecily thought about her daughter-in-law, or was it, again, sort of helped push your story through?
Yeah, I think you'll hear lots of people say, oh, Cecily Neville hated Elizabeth Woodville and opposed her queenship from the get-go. Well, the history tells us that isn't true. Once Elizabeth was queen, particularly in the early years of her reign, of Elizabeth's reign as queen, Cecily went to great lengths to support her queenship and make it easier for her. You know, she loaned her women and advisors and staff to help her ease into this role as queen. Because you have to remember too that as much as Edward didn't expect to be king, even more so, Elizabeth Woodville hadn't been groomed for that sort of role. She was minor aristocracy at best. What I think happened was that this was not the marriage that Cecily would have chosen for Edward at all. She was aiming, I think, for a nice, rich French heiress of royal blood to make a good political and strategic marriage. Yeah, that's what she wanted. And Edward, bad boy, went away and married in secret a Lancastrian widow who was older than him, already had 2 children, had no money to bring to the marriage, nothing to bring to the marriage in terms of prestige. It was a disaster. And worse than that, he did it in secret and didn't tell her. And there's one thing that really makes Cecily angry is not knowing what's going on. So when she hears about that marriage with Elizabeth Woodville, she is going to be furious. But, you know, once it's done, she settles down, I think, and she accepts it and she gets on with it and she swallows that bitter pill. And that makes sense to me, because when you think about it, what Cecily was intent on doing more than anything was making Edward's young kingship, this new dynasty, secure. And her kicking up a lot of fuss about the wedding and the marriage, which was now a fait accompli by the time she's heard about it, is not going to help that. So I think she buckled down to it and she got on with Elizabeth as well as she could. And things only went catastrophically wrong between the two of them much later on in the relationship, when, you know, there were other members of Cecily's extended family who found Elizabeth Woodville much harder to live with than Cecily did, including the Earl of Warwick. And once Elizabeth had felt herself to be under attack from Cecily's extended family, that's when the relationship between Cecily and Elizabeth begins to break down.
And I'm going to mention probably one of my favourite characters of the Wars of the Roses, because I really enjoy Margaret Beaufort as a woman. I think her story is fascinating from where she starts to where she ends up. So how did you approach her character in the book?
Oh, Margaret Beaufort, isn't she amazing?
Yeah.
And I have to say that in the writing of her story, my sympathy for her and my admiration for her just grew and grew and grew, because she is dealt a very poor hand of cards by fate. She is an heiress of considerable value, but she is married at the age of 12 to Henry VI's stepbrother, and by the time she is 13 years old, she is becoming a mother. And that, even by the standards of the age, was frowned upon, to take a young girl to your bed so early, and for her to have to go through that experience so young. But it was all to do, you know, with the way that the marriage contract was written. She was caught out by the law, because if she died, he wouldn't have access to her inheritance unless the marriage had been consummated and fertile, that she had produced a child. And I think that accounts for his hurry in bedding her at 12 years old. So she gave birth to Henry Tudor when she was only just 13. And what we're led to understand is that birth was so traumatic that she was never able to conceive or deliver a child again. So that was a profound sort of emotional scar, I think. And then that one son, becomes the centre of her world. And through circumstance, she is separated from him so dramatically. And he is exiled in France from the age of sort of 14. And she is constantly struggling to bring him back to England in some way. And eventually, without getting into too many spoilers, that involves her in such an audacious set of decisions and actions. The level of risk that she took, it makes my blood freeze for her, because she just risked everything to bring him back to England with no certainty of success. I mean, she must have had nerves of steel. And yeah, I just really admire her. I think she's formidable. But I also think she's very, very like Cecily. And what often gets forgotten in history too is that the two of them knew each other very, very well. And they were on very good terms. And you can almost imagine, you know, Cecily is considerably older than Margaret. And you can imagine Margaret kind of looking up to Cecily as a sort of role model. Do you know what I mean? As sort of the older woman who knows the way the world works. And Margaret studies her game and follows her example. And that's very clear to me, the way when Margaret eventually becomes King's mother, when Henry VII comes to the throne, she models her behaviour in the role of King's mother on Cecily's. And they behave in exactly the same way. And it's just so speaks to me of an admiration between Margaret and Cecily that survived everything, I think.
Yeah, and it definitely comes across in the book, sort of the conversations they have, even when they're not necessarily on the same side. You can tell that there's definitely respect between the both of them, which isn't necessarily the same with the other women.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're so close. You know, they're both incredibly political, incredibly clever, really, really smart. They're both brave and ferocious and fearless. I mean, you know, you can't put a bus ticket between them. They're so alike. And fate throws them together in this terrible way. It's a glorious story, I think, the relationship between Cecily and Margaret.
Yeah, and again, it's another way of sort of showing that although there was two very much opposing factors on the battlefield, that wasn't always necessarily the case at home.
Yeah. 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 And that war drives people to do quite terrible things that if that heat of conflict wasn't there, these things would never happen. But in desperate times, people take desperate measures, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So now, in terms of the book, because of where we are, Alnwick, Northumberland, the Percy family, they're all mentioned in The King's Mother.
They are.
How important were the events in the north of England at that time?
Really important, I think. And the Percy family plays such a part in this whole story. I mean, Alnwick Castle itself was, as I'm sure you know, the most besieged castle during the whole of the Wars of the Roses. It was constantly changing hands between York and Lancaster. And, the Percys, for the majority of the war, were on the Lancastrian side, fighting with Henry VI and Marguerite of Anjou. And the third Earl, of course, was killed at the Battle of Towton, just as the King's Mother opens. And as Edward is becoming king, it's his victory at Towton that allows him to cement his rule. Henry Percy was killed in that battle, leading the van for Lancaster. And his son, the fourth Earl, who was, I think, only 12 at that time, 12 or 13, was put in the Tower. So at that point, that must have been quite a low point in the Percy family history, I think. And yet, he was eventually pardoned by Edward IV and reconciled with Edward IV. And in 1470, he was granted his earldom of Northumberland back. And subsequent to that, it appears that he remained loyal to Edward and indeed fought with Richard III at Bosworth. And, it turned out pretty well for the Percys, because I think they've been in Alnwick pretty much ever since, right? So they had a fairly tumultuous time, but from 1470 onwards, things have definitely been on the up for them. So it'll be really special, I think, to bring the King's Mother to Alnwick Castle, because it is such an iconic Wars of the Roses location. I mean, certainly when I received your invite to come and talk, the hairs stood up on the back of my neck at the thought of it. It's just...
Yeah.
It's wonderful, isn't it, when you can go to these places in history where tumultuous things that you have been thinking about all your life to be in the places where they happened. And that's just, it's really rich for me.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to having you here. Can you tell us a little bit about the event itself and what potentially you have planned for it?
Well, I am going to come and I am going to be at your disposal entirely to talk about these four remarkable women and everything that they did and everything that they achieved, and to share with you. It's quite exciting, in fact, because the King's Mother, I'm coming to you on the 9th of July, and the King's Mother, in fact, isn't published until the 11th of July, 2 days later. But I know we're going to have books there and available for sale, and I'll be happy to sign them. So, for people who are planning to come, this is going to be pretty much your first opportunity to get your hands on this book and the first people to hear about the story. So, I'm hoping it's going to be a really exciting evening.
I think so. I think we've got a couple of things that might be out for you.
I feel so lucky. It's it is such a wonderful thing when you go to locations that are so closely associated with the events of the book. Mm-hmm. It's just magical.
And you've mentioned that you've already started working on another book, but there is some exciting news about Cecily, potentially an adaptation, is that correct?
So Cecily, the first book, which deals with Cecily's early life, has been optioned for television by a production company run by three women who are intent upon telling stories about strong women. So it's right up their street, I think. It's too early days to say how that might all materialise and work out. it's a very exciting development, and you can imagine really exciting for me because it's opening up, a whole new world and conversations that I never expected to have about TV adaptations and things like that. So, yeah, it's thrilling news.
So thank you very much, Annie, for joining us on the podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in person in July.
You are very welcome, and I will see you on the 9th of July. It's the date.
The King's Mother will be available from all good bookshops from the 11th of July.
If you'd like to see Annie Garthwaite speaking about the King's Mother here at Alnwick Castle on Tuesday the 9th of July and get your copy of the book 2 days early, tickets are still available, so head to alnwickcastle.com or find Alnwick Castle on Eventbrite to book your place now.
If you enjoy this podcast, head into our archive to find more conversations with authors such as Tracy Borman and Susie Edge, and look out for more book-related episodes in the future.
We'll be back with another podcast in 2 weeks, but until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.